Well, thank you, everybody, and thank you to the Internet Society and to the Program Committee for having me here today. Some of you know me, some of you don't. My name's Karen Rose, and I'm the principal of a boutique consulting firm named Zinnia Digital. But prior to that, I worked for the Internet Society. And myself and Michuki are two of the co-initiators of AfPIF, along with many of you here in the community. And thank you, of course, to Rogers Capital for hosting this meeting. Rogers Capital, their business slogan is keep evolving, and I think that's a good theme that encapsulates what we want to do, Michuki and I, in this presentation today, which is basically to take a look at how AfPIF started, what the internet looked like during that time, how AfPIF has evolved over the last 10 meetings, as well as the internet in Africa, and to leave you all with some thoughts, or our thoughts, about the work that needs to be done moving forward. Okay, so the beginning to what eventually became AfPIF, the ideas of it were actually started in about 2007 and 2008. And the internet in Africa looked very different at the time. And just to give you some context, there were only 5.3% of the population in Africa with an internet connection. It was the lowest level of internet penetration in the entire world. At the same time, however, Africa also had the highest level of growth of internet connectivity in the world, a growth rate of over 1,000%. So things were really starting to happen. Satellite connections, however, were predominant on the continent. This is a map of the undersea cable infrastructure in 2008, and as you can see, it was a pretty lonely place. So satellite costs for transit were about $3,000 to $5,000 per megabit per second. $3,000 to $5,000. If you wanted to get transit on an undersea cable, that was running on Sat3, that was running about $4,500 to $12,000 per megabit per second. Pretty phenomenal. Africa was also really an island continent. If you looked at the topography in 2007 and 2008 about how Africa connected with its neighbors in the rest of the world, it really looked more like the topography of how the Pacific Islands connected. Most things were done by satellite. There were only about 400,000 kilometers of terrestrial transmission network in Africa. And that's actually a high number because in that 400,000 that was estimated, there were a lot of planned projects that hadn't yet rolled out. There was very limited cross-border connectivity in Africa and very limited local content being hosted here. The policy dialogue at the time, in 2007, 2008, was focusing on imposing telecom-style accounting rates to the internet. The buzzword was revenue apportionment. So basically, we're going to share the costs of this connectivity rather than having it as a regular business transaction. And a lot of those conversations were happening outside of Africa, in places like Geneva, Switzerland, rather than inside Africa. So that was a bit of the landscape of what it looked like at the time that AfPIF was being conceived. So as we all know and have been discussing, how networks interconnect and exchange traffic fundamentally drives the economics and performance of the internet. It impacts affordability, it impacts user experience, and for network businesses and investors, interconnection and traffic exchange drives the value of those networks. So our thought, as the Internet Society and was shared by many in the community, is that if we could help make that system of interconnection and traffic exchange more efficient, perhaps we could help contribute to the development of the internet in Africa. And as I mentioned, there were many others in the community, the African community here and externally, that shared that point of view, that thought that focusing on interconnection and traffic exchange would be a key catalyst. So instead of first starting out with AfPIF, we actually first started out about thinking about creating an exchange point association. That was our first point of entry. So in about 2007, 2008, Michuki and I set about trying to contact Internet exchange point operators in Africa to put together an exchange point association. The map on the top was the commonly used map about the number of exchanges in Africa, about 23 Internet exchanges in about 19 countries. But what we quickly found out was that that was really a number of exchange points on paper, not so much in reality. As we started trying to call around to get people together for an exchange point meeting, we found that we couldn't find people who were designated managers for many of the exchanges. A number of people who started an exchange had moved on, so the boxes and the wires were no longer plugged in or connected. There was still a dot on a map. One time we called one operator to try and find the person who was a manager, and they said it was the last person who had the key. So we said, well, who's the last person who had the key? And nobody really knew who had the key. There were a lot of development projects that had gone fallow. Development agencies that had focused their investment on Internet exchange points, on the boxes, on the technology, but it didn't do as much in terms of training and capacity building. And so a lot of those were on very briefly and then were turned off or scuttled. And for the exchange points that were around, a lot of them had little growth and there were few networks participating. That bottom map there is also a data point, was the number of root server instances in Africa at the time. So there were really only about 5. So we really were not very successful at the time in 2007 and 2008 in trying to put together an exchange point association. But in 2008, we had a meeting at AfNog, and we had a meeting with a number of different partners, a number of different stakeholders, to talk about the broader issue of interconnection and traffic exchange and the value proposition of that in Africa. And there were a lot of people who thought that that was the right conversation to have at the right time, to focus on interconnection, focus more broadly at that time than just on exchange points. So we and a number of different organizations in the internet community had been already doing things related to interconnection and traffic exchange, but a lot of us really started to ramp up that work and start new projects related to interconnection. And for our part at the Internet Society, we decided to take a systems approach to thinking about how to catalyze this market, how to catalyze this landscape. And that was one of the illustrations we drew of trying to draw a stakeholder and influencer map for interconnection and traffic exchange across Africa. The project methodology we used, by the way, is called outcome mapping. It is based in systems theory, and if you are working on any projects yourself aimed at creating change, I highly recommend that you take a look into it. So, we knew that we had to take a broader view, and so did many of our colleagues in the internet community. So there were a multitude of efforts that we did and community members did aimed at priming the pump on interconnection and traffic exchange in Africa. Some of the things that we and others did, for example, were local workshops in capacity building on routing and interconnection techniques. We did these in conjunction with organizations like NSRC, Afrinic, and others. Supporting the development of new IXPs, which was very complementary to work, for example, that Packet Clearinghouse was also doing in Africa in the space. Supporting existing IXPs and helping them to grow value, doing things like helping people get root servers to make the IXs more valuable to members, something that we did as well as Afrinic was doing and ICANN was doing as well. Advocating in regional and international policy forums and local forums Again, it was a real community effort on this score, including by a number of partners that we had in Europe. I'm looking at Narani here, and the European exchanges were very helpful in working with us on the policy front internationally and in Africa. We also engaged development and funding organizations. One of the things that I think is really unique about the African landscape is that development agencies have a very big influence on the shape of markets and how efficient they are here, particularly in the early years. As you all know, there's a lot of money spent in loans or in development projects on digging trenches and pulling network capacity, and the way in which those development agencies spend their money can either help or hurt the development of the market. So one of the things we did was really seek to engage development agencies and funding organizations, which evolved into a very beneficial project that we had with the African Union, which Michuki will talk about a little bit. And finally, we also engaged in a lot of work on measurement and research, because the data was definitely needed. So in that context, AfPIF was really, our thought was, hopefully going to be the glue that would sustain and build momentum, where the community could come together on this broad range of issues, but also in the context of other work that was happening in the space. One of the key observations that we and others had, and the thing that we thought was really could be the break on the growth of networking in Africa, was this issue of information asymmetry. We saw it all over the place. And information asymmetry is a term for a condition where one party to an economic transaction, for a negotiation, possesses greater material knowledge of what's going on in that market than the other party. And what we found is that there was a huge information asymmetry between Africa and the rest of the world that was not tipping the balance in Africa's favor. One of the key problems, especially in the early years, and quite understandably, was that there was a lot of focus on African network operators were focusing within the boundaries of their network, right? There were a lot of issues and things that they needed to sort at home, policy issues, customer issues, network growth, and business issues, that they weren't thinking as much as to what was happening to their bits once they left their network. As one network operator quoted to us, he said, "Look, I manage my network and I buy the internet," right? So what happens after those bits leave my network, somebody else can handle, just tell me how much I need to pay. Well, of course, that really hampered the negotiation ability and the ability for networks to develop strategy here on the continent. So one of the key requirements as we were and others were doing this work, and what we wanted to bring into AfPIF, was to help increase the knowledge and the relationships necessary to even out this information asymmetry between Africa and the rest of the world, to help people negotiate better deals, create peering opportunities, sustain local and regional traffic exchange, catalyze growth, and attract new services. So I started discussing, way back to 2007 to 2008. So while 2010 was really the first AfPIF, this work was really a work in progress for a number of years across the community, coming together to identify what needed to be done, what kind of venues we needed to have to pull all the stakeholders together in a way that we can move forward. So AfPIF 1 in 2010, I can tell you it was much less fancy than this AfPIF meeting here. I think there was no stage. We had an old coffee table that served as our panel. I was trying to find more pictures of Michuki at AfPIF when I was putting this slide together, but I couldn't, and then I remembered, because in addition to everything else, Michuki was also managing the webcasting and doing the soundboard. So it was a real sort of bootstrapping effort. But it was 2 days, and we had about 80 attendees, and 20 African countries participated, as well as international participants. And I think this is a great time to say thank you to people who were there at the beginning, especially those in the community that helped put together the program, helped put together and select speakers for AfPIF 1. our local host, TESPOC in Kenya, and the local our sponsors that we had for that first initial AfPIF, which was NetNode, D6, Orange, AM6, and Google. So from that background, AfPIF was on the road.
Thank you, Karen. So I'd like to take up from here and say that AfPIF was on the road, but take any sport that you know. AfPIF is like the final game that you go and play. So the success of the event is pretty much based on what you've done before getting onto the pitch, right? So if you didn't do any training before, you get to the pitch, you get nailed by the, your opponent team. So there was a lot of stuff that was happening outside of AfPIF before we got to AfPIF. So Karen has talked about the internal work that we did, but there was also stuff that was happening on the ground, in Africa, within the continent, on the ground. Before I go into that, I want to take a minute to put up some slides, and I call these the slippery slope slide, because once you start mentioning names and putting logos up there, you will have forgotten someone, and they'll be like, you forgot me, or something like that. So these are organizations that have a shared interest in IXP development, have been for a long time in the space, 10 years before AfPIF, and have actually played a role in the development of interconnection. Whether it's through capacity development, in that they've helped with training, they've given equipment to some exchange points, they've contributed resources, whether it's measurements, where it's just basic exposure, getting engineers or IXP operators from Africa to see what other exchange points look like in more developed markets, so that you can get a bigger picture of what the IXP will look like. All these organizations have played a role. I'm not sure I've captured all, but those I've forgotten, please do forgive me. But these ones are the ones that stand out to, in my view, in terms of the work that we've done over the last 10 years and before that. Now, when I joined the Internet Society in 2008, working with Karen, one of the things we had to do is look at where we need to go in terms of the countries. Now, as you all know, Africa is a big continent. It has quite a lot of diversity, language barriers, French, Arabic, English, Portuguese. But we've tried over the last 11 years going through the continent in terms of capacity development, equipment, helping set up new exchange points, community mobilization, just trying to bring the community together towards setting up an internet exchange point. And in some country more than once. If you go through that map, you'll see we've been in about 28 countries. So that's no mean achievement. So I like to recognize that it's been a consistent and continuous effort. And as a result of that, there was an opportunity that came up in 2012, initiated by the African Union, called the African Union Axis Project, which was looking at IXP development. Well, we said, there's a bid out there by the African Union. ISOC doesn't bid for projects. Should we let some random consultant from those circles apply for that project and go do something that we have to go clean up after? Or should we go and bid for it and see what we can do? Well, we sat down as an organization and said, it's unusual, but let's try it. Because after all, we probably are in a better position to work with the community to do a better project than what someone else would do. So we went in, we put the project proposal, and what we did differently, maybe compared to others, is we said, we do not want to be the consultant. We want to partner with you, the African Union, to implement this project. And so we did. What I like about this project, well, it was successful in some ways, and it was not successful in some other ways. But the two key takeaways I like to take out of the Axis project is, one, it enabled us to create awareness about IXPs across the continent more than any other project that has ever been initiated in the region on that issue. Today, if you speak to policymakers around the continent, they know what an exchange point is. If you go to networks and they understand that they need an exchange point. The second thing was the capacity side of it. When we started these workshops, and we did 60 workshops across 28 countries in Africa and touching over 30 African countries, we struggled to get experts who could teach or talk about IXPs in French from the continent. So we had to go out of continent and find people who've been running IXPs and speak French or Portuguese or Spanish to actually come help the countries that speak those languages on the issue. And so we went out, our friends from France IX and Lyon IX came in and they helped us. But in the process, we also got to train local French-speaking experts. And so today, if we want to do a workshop in any part of Africa, we actually do have an expert in IXPs that speaks the language of that particular region. So those two things were key successes that I think we got out of this project that we've been doing. With that, I'd like to segue back into AfPIF. So again, part of this presentation, we'll be going out in of AfPIF and, or rather, talk about AfPIF, then go out of AfPIF, so that you get a feel about how the two relate between the work in the region with the community and what really happens at AfPIF. So back to Karen to talk about the key value builders of AfPIF.
Great. Thanks, Michuki. Well, after AfPIF 1, we were on the road, and as Michuki said, I think we had such a strong start, and one of the lessons learned was that a lot of work was done before getting to AfPIF 1. But, as soon as we had the first couple of meetings, I think we and others that were helping in the program committee were constantly thinking about how can we add value to AfPIF as an event. And one of the key value builders for AfPIF, I think, was the focus that was put on bringing the content providers and global networks to AfPIF. At first, it was really mostly focused on African networks, and the African networks, of course, were more of the eyeball networks, and most of the content for Africa was hosted overseas. So Africa had a really fast growing internet market. Most of the networks here were eyeball networks. And many of the global providers outside that either had the content or were interested in interconnecting with African networks, they had a really limited understanding of the market here in Africa. And again, as I mentioned, nearly all the content was hosted outside. So we thought it was a real mutual opportunity for the benefit of AfPIF and for the benefit of the outside world to try and bring the content providers and global networks here to AfPIF. So there was a big push in the early years in order to explain and help educate the outside world about the African market, about the opportunities here, and to bring content and global providers to AfPIF. And I want to say that a special thanks to the European Peering Forum. EPF 5 and EPF 7, they had us out to present about AfPIF, about the African market, and it really helped catalyze a lot of interest. Another great thing that came out of this close working with the European Peering Forum is that African networks are now, for example, going to EPF. It's a really good example of the mutual beneficial relationships that there are in the internet community. And as well, in addition to European and American networks coming here, we're now seeing Asian networks come to AfPIF. So I think really focusing on how you grow the net of stakeholders that come to AfPIF is a key lesson learned and a key value builder that we had on the road. Also, when we were talking about information asymmetry in particular, there was a real need to level the playing field in terms of knowledge and opportunity, as well as personal connections. So one of the things that we really focused on with AfPIF in the early years was learning and networking in terms of, handshakes between people. So I think over in the first 5 years of AfPIF, we actually had the peering game with Dr. Peering, Bill Norton at the first 5 AfPIFs to do a lot of work on education and training. We distributed over 600 books on peering throughout Africa, through AfPIF and through the other work that we were doing in the continent. We also had the peering book, the peering playbook translated into French. So we could distribute this knowledge to more than just the English-speaking parts of Africa. And in terms of handshakes and personal networking, we started with AfPIF 10. We didn't even keep data back then, but we did a few peering personals. I think we had about 8 at AfPIF 10. And those started to grow slowly. But what I think was a real breakthrough in terms of catalyzing real relationships and catalyzing business at AfPIF was the introduction of the peering meeting tool, which was initially donated by D6 in the early years. And if you look at that chart there, the light yellow bar is a bar of the number of meetings that have been facilitated and taken place through the peering meeting tool. So that, again, was another real big value builder for AfPIF and a lesson learned to keep evolving as the meetings roll on.
So this, to me, is one of the most loaded slides that I had to prepare because it says a lot of things in very few words. One of the things that we had to think about was the vision for AfPIF. What is the vision? Where are we going? And where I come from, we normally say that if you talk about someone when they're not there, they'll always bite themselves or trip themselves if they're walking. So I'm glad Karen is here because I'm going to talk about something that she used to say. She used to talk about building a cathedral. We need to build a cathedral. How do you build a cathedral? And what's the process? One brick at a time. What does it take? You have to have the big picture and see where you're going. So the whole cathedral thing was something that helped us to imagine what would you want to see. And the big picture here was that Africa needs to be able to create content, not just to be a consumer. We had done some initial measurements around 2008, and some of the data sets shows that I did some measurements then to see how much traffic was being exchanged in the continent. And so you'll see this 99% of the traffic consumed in Africa was imported. And that was an issue. So how do we change that? Well, we need to make sure that we have community buy-in. We need to make sure that the process is sustainable, that networks are able to come on board. But then, how do you make it catchy? And so I remember having a discussion with David, and David said, we have to be ambitious, like go out and say the things like the UN and the World Economic Forum and all those people have these things. At that time was the Millennium Development Goals. They had some catchy phrase, and we all knew they wouldn't get there, but it was nice and ambitious. So he said, what's the most ambitious thing we can do? Well, we say, 80-20 by 2020. First, we started with something 70-30, and we felt, it wasn't ambitious enough. Are we sure? Yeah. And then we went to 80-20 by 2020. And the first person I spoke to about that said, dude, you're too ambitious. Not possible. But in itself, 80-20 by 2020 meant a lot of things. And I understand why they thought it was ambitious, because it means data centers. It means creating content. What percentage of networks, cross-border interconnection, all of those things need to happen if we are to keep 80% or access 80% of the content we consume from the region. But I said, well, let's try. David, being the scientist and the academician, said, but we need to have some backup information as to why we are saying this. He said, yeah, but let's try. So we went out with it. A couple of years later, I remember speaking to Matthew Chikwende from Liquid, and he says, yeah, we'll get to 30 before 2020. That's what he said. In fact, it was 80-20 before 2020. I said, okay, someone has bitten into this. They're running with it. It could be real. I also remember that in AfPIF 2012, we had a panel session. It was titled Terrestrial Capacity from Cape Town to Cairo, Reality or Illusion. Do you remember that panel for those who are there? So we dreamed this up. Where's Nishal? We thought, yeah, let's try and come up with an impossible panel for people to discuss. Is it a reality or an illusion? We had Ben Roberts on that panel and a few others. And then later on, last year, I see this sticker, Cape to Cairo, the audacity of hope. Like, okay, someone did get something out of it. So having that vision, or sharing that big vision with the community, has actually helped make some milestones. So we have seen networks that are actually talking about 80-20 by 2020. So I would like to hear, I've heard before that they've reached 80-20 by 2020. And indeed, we do have terrestrial, not wet packets, but terrestrial packets from Cape to Cairo. So we can continue dreaming. Because we will get there if we work together as a community. So.
Oh, just one other thing. One of the other goals that we had starting out was that hopefully by 10 meetings, the Internet Society in particular could start moving back from its role in organizing AfPIF, and AfPIF would really be self-sustainable. And it's fantastic that AfIX has stepped up to help lead that effort, and a real testament to the work of the exchange point operators, I think, in putting that organization together, where back in 2007, 2008, you couldn't even get people to answer the phone. So it was a real evolution of what was going on in the community, and another place where I think where we had our 10-year sustainability goal for AfPIF, and it helped catalyze us to get there.
So going slightly back out to see, so we've seen what was going on AfPIF. Going back out, let's see what happened. The infrastructure development was happening. When we started the 2008, as Karen said, there were barely any IXPs that were being responsive. Today we are talking about 45 IXPs, the newest one being Somalia, and I'm glad they're here. Somalia. I'm excited about Somalia for a simple reason. It is a difficult place to actually go in and do stuff. If you want to go to Somalia today, your employer, the first thing they will ask you is, you want to do what? But Nishal got on a plane and went there and set up an exchange point. They did it, but you helped. And they're here. So peering is taking place. Even in the most difficult circumstances that you could think of, it is actually taking place. And there are more networks connected. More networks in West Africa, Central Africa, and in the Indian Ocean Islands than at the beginning. There was a first map that Karen showed about DNS infrastructure. There wasn't much. But look at it today. As more exchange points go in, as more interconnections go in, DNS infrastructure has followed. It gives end users a better internet experience. And that's key. So what's following next? Data centers. We are building data centers. Statistics I got from our friends at Terraco say, based on their market intelligence and estimates, we are heading towards 100,000 square meters of multi-tenancy data centers. And there's a lot of power requirements that's following suit that we can deal with, but making people make that conscious decision to invest in data center space is really key, because that 80-20 by 2020 doesn't happen if you have nowhere to host. So this is happening, and the community is coming together to make this a reality. And we can talk about, yeah.
Oh. Yeah, and this is just an image. If you remember the first slide that I showed in 2007, 2008, where only one lonely little cable going up the west coast of Africa, not much happening on the east. This is what the terrestrial and submarine cable environment looks like in Africa today. So we've seen a really big change in investment and growth, and just some comparative statistics. In 2008, as I mentioned, internet penetration in Africa was 5.3%. Today, a little over 10 years later, it's 40%, and still one of the fastest growing markets in the world. Terrestrial transmission network, as I mentioned, in 2007, 2008, was about 400,000 kilometers, probably less than that because a lot was planned and not actually in the ground. And today, Hamilton Research estimates that there's 1.4 million kilometers of terrestrial transmission network. Better, but still more work to be done. Transit costs that were $3,000 to $12,000 to $12,000 megabits per second, 2007, 2008. Last year in the presentation, at the AfPIF presentation, Patrick from Telegeography, I think had a weighted average of about $5. I mean, just unbelievable change that's happened in the market. International bandwidth in Africa is growing at about 45% compound annual growth per year. So the market keeps accelerating, changes keep happening, and just a little thing to keep in the back of the mind as we move forward, as this landscape changes, thinking about how AfPIF needs to change and evolve as conditions on the ground continue to change.
So where are we? So coming back to AfPIF, I think we're at AfPIF 10.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, we're at AfPIF 10, and Cape Town to Cairo, as Michuki mentioned, was a slogan. In 10 meetings, we didn't quite get to Cape Town to Cairo, but we got to Cape Town to Casablanca, which is pretty darn close. So this is a map of where all of the AfPIF meetings have taken place, the last 10 meetings, including here in lovely Mauritius. One of the things to note is there's still a lot of places in Africa that haven't hosted an AfPIF meeting. So if you're from one of the countries that's on this map and you're interested in hosting AfPIF, please do talk to the program committee. One of the benefits, I think, of this meeting is that it does go to different regions, so it can attract people from the continent as a whole as well as regionally. So again, if you're interested in hosting an AfPIF meeting, please talk to the program committee. We want to see your star on the map going forward.
So one thing this map doesn't tell you is the journeys to those countries. So they've been fun, interesting, and some not so fun. AfPIF 5, for instance, stands in my mind because it was the celebration of the five-year anniversary of AfPIF. But also, with all the advanced planning, there was the Ebola outbreak, and we had to make a decision. Are we going or are we not going? And we still went to Senegal because there was no Ebola in Senegal, but there was Ebola around West Africa, or as the media said, I'm quoting the media, which made it look like there was something in Senegal as well. It was a good event. Not everyone we hoped would show up for obvious reasons, and which we fully understand. But we still did manage to get there. The good thing about that event, we ended up having the highest number of women attending. So that to me was quite a surprise. And when I look at other countries where we've been to, like Morocco, we have the Beers for Peers tonight, right? So what happens when you go to Morocco and you have a Beers for Peers? What do you call it? Because alcohol is haram. So there have been interesting challenges along the way in getting the event organized. And here I would like to, really tip my hat off to the team, the logistics team that is involved in putting this event together, because the innovation and the ability to come around and find solutions to make this event a success is really huge. And also for people to just travel. I mean, we're trying to route packets and make them stay within the continent. Yeah, air travel doesn't conform. And we're learning that. So, another thing that has been really important for us is the program committee. And you will get to see them throughout the next 3 days. The co-chairs, Nishal and Kyle, have done an excellent job in steering the work that gets done with the PC. There will be a call for new PC members for the next to the 2020 PC. So we invite the community, please respond to the call for volunteers. It is a lot of work, but it is actually very rewarding. Another really important milestone that we've been able to accomplish through AfPIF is the creation of AfIX. The first informal meeting, which I really remember, was actually at AfPIF 2012 in Johannesburg. I remember seeing Frank and Barry, and I think Nishal had lost his voice at that time. He wasn't even speaking. They met over lunch, sat and started a discussion on what are we going to do. The fulfillment we have with this is that this is what we actually wanted to start with at the beginning, but it actually took a different path to get there, natural evolution. And it is growing. One of the interesting statistics that I have is that with the AfIX meeting, which normally takes place on the Monday before AfPIF starts, that is what helped bring the IXP community to attend. Yesterday I did a count. There were 21 IXPs from Africa present at the meeting. Fellowship to a fraction of them. Now, this is the other interesting part, that for most of the IXPs present, they had more than one participant attending, which is good. And I know why there are 2 or 3, because they need the meeting tool. They can't all go to the same meeting, and there are 200 people to meet, so you need to split up. So that is smart. I am extremely excited about AfIX and the future that it has for the peering ecosystem in this region. We look at the statistics attendance. I think I've been completely blown away, I have to say. Every year we think, okay, we've picked a country where turnout won't be so high, and at the very last minute we're telling the hotel we need to up the numbers. We thought we'll not get beyond 200, and at the very last minute we say no. Cape Town we partnered with IWIC. That was a really great thing that we did, but logistically, we ended up having 450 people showing up, and we only had planned for about 200, 250. So it's a good thing, good problem to have, but it's been growing. I would also like to recognize that the community has also felt that there is a gender gap. And so we need to get more women coming in. How do we mentor them? And so we started the Women in Tech Fellowship Program. And thank you to the sponsors for the Women in Tech Fellowship Program. We've been able to bring at least 6 women to this event, additional women specifically to this event. Sponsorship has grown. And yes.
Sponsorship has grown. And one of the interesting things that we were talking about is, AfPIF has pretty much been a break-even event since its inception. And one of the reasons was, in the beginning is because, we had card tables, Michuki doing the soundboard, people stuffing badges. It was a real sort of a bootstrap project. But as the sponsors have grown, AfPIF has been able to do much, much more to bring more people in and to increase the value that it brings to the community. And even beyond the numbers of the monetary contributions that come to sponsorship, I think these numbers here and the number of sponsors participating is a real testament to the value that people see in having a meeting like AfPIF. So it's not just the amount of money, it's the number of people raising their hand and saying that they want to be part of this meeting, which I think is a really great foundation for AfPIF going forward.
So beyond AfPIF, there's been a lot of other impact we can see. We started working on measurements because one of the questions we wanted to ask ourselves is, are we really having any impact? Is it really working? Is there any growth? So we spent some time with a research scientist called Rodrigue Fanu, who is from Benin, and we came up with a tool called the African Route Collectors Data Analyzer, or ARDA, which is now hosted and managed by AfIX. And basically, when you look at the data, it tells you that, yes, there are more networks in Africa that are now visible at internet exchange points. And yes, if you talk to IXPs and work with them, you actually see they're having impact. An example of Burkina Faso. They've come to these meetings, they've met CDNs, they've been able to go back, deploy CDNs in their countries, so there is a lot of traffic. We do training workshops, we help unlock technical issues that they may have, and so traffic is growing. And so the impact of the national IXPs is being felt. The amount of traffic being exchanged at national IXPs, according to AfIX, is well above 700 gig. And that's a lot. I think looking at some of the statistics, it's quite a lot, quite a huge growth over the period. How about cross-border interconnection? Are peers or carriers going across the border? So if you look at those graphs, I didn't have a better way of presenting them, so it starts from left to right and then top to bottom. You will see that in 2010 there wasn't much. 2014, not really. That's just PCH popping up in many IXPs that we could measure. Then come 2016, you have 4 ASNs being visible, peering across other exchange points across the continent. And by the year, these last 12 months, there are 20 ASNs that you're seeing that are visible in more than 20% of the exchange points in Africa. Are those carriers, when they get there, do they have open peering or selective peering? When you get to the exchange points, then you see that around 2016, you see about 574 ASNs popping up across multiple IXPs. The question is why? Well, the only thing I do remember that really changed was that Mark Tinker came and stood up at AfPIF 2015 and said, we're changing our peering policy. It has been selective in Africa and open in Europe. Now we are doing open in Africa and open in Europe. The stats the next year show, 574 new ASNs are visible across multiple exchange points. Okay? I think Liquid followed shortly after the announcement from CECOM, and then we got new international peers showing up in the continent, and now you're seeing 16,000 prefixes popping up in multiple IXPs across the continent. So there's something happening. There are many ASNs. We try to figure out where they're coming from. And then we see quite a number of ASNs coming from ARIN region. Well, at the beginning there was something broken with the data stats, but there's Afrinic, there's ARIN, there's RIPE NCC ASNs showing up in the continent. And so it means the region is growing, is attracting networks to come in and peer. And that's really what we wanted to see. There is movement. But
looking forward, it's been a great run, I think, for AfPIF for the last 10 meetings and even before getting on the playing field. But really the work has just begun. There's progress in Africa, as we've seen. One of the issues, however, is that the progress on internet growth and development, the progress on interconnection has been uneven across Africa. Some regions are really way out ahead, and some regions still have a lot of challenges. And the participation in AfPIF, if you look from the countries in which participants come from, has also been uneven. And one of the goals that I would suggest for the program committee and others going forward is to really have a specific goal to get all countries in Africa, representatives from all countries in Africa, and all African service providers to AfPIF. Like, start a list of service providers in Africa and figure out who has been to AfPIF and who hasn't, and go and get them in this room. There is still a big need. And education and information sharing efforts are still really needed as well. I am currently living in North Africa, and with this issue about uneven progress, you can really see who's been participating and who hasn't. And for me, I hope that North Africa can be a bit of a focus as well. There's a need to get the data center space and community to collaborate and to integrate a little bit more with AfPIF. That's obviously mutually dependent. And there needs to be a focus on creating a more robust content ecosystem in Africa. This has been something that was started early on in AfPIF, but the need is still there. The 80-20 by 2020 is a goal that hasn't been achieved. And more work needs to be done to make sure that, Africa is an internet creator and not just an internet consumer, including for things like content. We're far from that 80-20 by 2020 reality, but not in all areas. There needs to be increased focus and a refocus on policy and regulation. I have to say some of the same bad ideas keep popping up over, the 10 years, 15 years in policy and regulatory spaces. There's still cumbersome legal and regulatory environments in many countries, and work needs to be done locally in order to help improve those. And in addition to bad ideas still coming back in the policy and regulatory space, new bad ideas keep emerging as well. So there's development happening, not just here, but all over the world, that might set back progress that's been made. So AfPIF, and for the people in this room, I think we really need to consider that we need to restart that focus on policy and regulatory work. Also, there needs to be more work and more data collected about what's happening in Africa. For those of you who sponsor projects, please consider sponsoring research, sponsoring data collection, into what is actually happening on the continent. It's good for venues like AfPIF to see how much progress is being made, but that information is also good for the businesses, many of you here in this room, who rely on that data to make business decisions. So there's a real benefit. Better statistics are key, especially in the peering space. There needs to be more data and statistics. So again, if you think of funding projects, if you're a funder, please do consider helping to fund research and data collection efforts in Africa.
So most importantly, the future of AfPIF will depend on this community. And for the last 10 years, I have to say I'm extremely proud to have been a member of this community. It's been a pleasure to work with Karen for the first 5 years of making this happen. And I look forward to many more. And with that, I'd like to just we request if we could run a video that we've just prepared just to show the images behind those 10 years.